So, welcome to the voice calling out from the darkness of your famous and favorite insane asylum called the Now. So one of the things that I think that I've been considering, that's been striking to me, and has to do with the sense of place. Now, by place, I don't necessarily mean a location, but the body, place is a kind of body that gathers into the characters and the plots of the unfolding of a region or a town or a country. Right? It has being. And place isn't like when I say I don't think it's a location, is because it really isn't material, right? It's not, you can't look and find the place and the stuff. But the stuff is organized, and the architecture is organized, and even the dialect and the accent of that dialect and the manners and the customs are kind of gathered together via this, in some sense, this this gathering, that which gathers, which is place, a sense of place. When you're in Chicago, you can tell you're in Chicago, right? It's like, it's like Chicago. Like, well, what makes it like Chicago? Well, you start to get, it's because of the place. Chicago's a place. So many things coming together. It's just a rich, very rich thing when you really start to look at it and to kind of see it and confront it and counter it. And I think this probably has a lot to do with a lot of things, right? But I would imagine it has something to do with especially when the wall came down in Germany, right? And the USSR fell. It was the beginning of, in some sense, liberalism losing its place, at least its centralized place, or the sense of its place being in the United States. And kind of the last competing, kind of theory of governance, the USSR fell. And it really didn't have any competition in some sense, right? And I think this is all started happening before this, but seems like a good historical marker to really start to look through it and see what we see. But then, so when liberalism, right, kind of loses its sense of place, which is in some sense the place grounds, like we'll say, liberalism in America and in the traditions of America, and it's located in place and held together in place, and there's traditions and ideas, and they're local in some sense. They're bounded, they're constrained. And And because they're constrained, they get to take hold in the earth in some sense. And you can see it. And you can see it self-organize through the kind of encounter with the world, the necessities of not just not ideas, but those ideas are kind of in some sense informing and informed by the encounter with the facticity and necessity that place dwells in. And so when it won, then all of a sudden it's like the only game in town in some respect, right? And so it just had no resistance in just becoming the world. And rapidly, it seems that the ideas of liberalism, especially the ideas of the freedom and the inalienable rights of the individual, start to hold sway and shape and take over the world. I think you could see that, man. I mean, you just go anywhere now, and there's, lots of liberal democracies and various forms of it. And obviously, there's exceptions to those things, but I think we get the idea, right? And there's a problem with that, because then once it becomes the world order, then it's in some sense no longer noticed as such. All those things are kind of taken for granted as like the substance, right? That's just given and no one really questions it. It's obvious, right? You should look at things like this because it's just self-evident that you do. Yet, when it becomes everything, in some sense it becomes nowhere and everywhere, which is nowhere. You lose all difference. And I think one of the things that I'm imagining that has happened in the lockdowns, where all of our routines, right, with COVID, was all of our routines were shut down, and all of our manic careerism and all the stuff, everyone had to stop. And in stopping, you start staying at home. However, I think what you discover, what a lot of people are probably experiencing, maybe not calling it this, but I think maybe we can start to see if this is it. But I think what they're experiencing is when they go home, they have no place. And when the because human life has always been filled with repetition and rhythms. Lots of repetition, right? And normativity via repetition. However, when that repetition isn't grounded in the earth and the encounter with the indigenousness of one's place that is kind of filled with history, right? Man, that repetition looks more and more, probably is experienced as absolute meaningless. Because one can imagine, right? It's Middle Ages or something, right? Where there's a town and you're a farmer in that town, and everyone goes to this church, and there's the narrative of the church and the sense of the transcendent, and kind of organizes everything in that place, right? And there's, most of the time, right, back then, the place that you're dwelling in, and the repetitions and the cycles of your day and your year are filled with these festivals and these rhythms. And, right, back then, one had the sense that the time that they were born in had been happening forever and was going to be like that forever. It's a very different thing, right? Now we're, like, now it seems self-evident that, like, in 5 years, everything's going to be different. But just imagine that, and imagine what the experience is like of the repetition of the cycles of the moon and the holidays and the festivals. And not only that, but almost everybody that you've known your whole life, right? And the sense of obligation, right? That because you didn't have this kind of a liberal freedom from all tradition, freedom from all your rights to be free from everything human, like, you fulfilling on your roles was everything, right? Things, I think, would be so much more of a lived meaning, right? Now, I'm not necessarily saying that people were probably happier or something in some, like, it sounds like it'd be really hard, right? But in some sense, just saturated with meaning. So I would imagine the repetition and the cycles and the rhythms were experienced as the unfolding of a kind of meaning that went very deep in a lived sense of history, right? So now, though, without that, right, with this kind of globalism, right, where, basically being in Chicago and being in Sydney and being in London and being these things has less and less difference, right? And given that we're not hardly at all connected to the rhythms of the cycles of the seasons, right? This kind of ground up, embodied saturation with meaning. And without that, these repetitions are probably very painful. Start to feel very meaningless. We see the evidence of this. I would say, I think that one of the evidences is subdivisions, right? For example, like, I was in my sociology class. We talked about older cities, right? What older cities were based on was, in America anyways, was where the railroads would converge. And so as they started to all converge in one particular place, as you got closer to that convergence, the city started to get more and more built up and on top of each other. And you could see all these different periods of time that were built over and included in other periods of time and different things. And as you got to the very center, it was like the heart of the city. And you know, right there, it's kind of like that there's a necessity, an encounter with a a localized place, right? That the necessities in the encounter with the world, with the earth, right, was what started to take on the character of the place, and the place gave it character, right, and its rhythms and traditions, and right, it's all kind of on top of each other, right? But it's out of the necessities of the place.
Are you by chance going in 1170?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm gonna go in behind you.
Okay. And so, hang on here. Let me let him in. Sure. So, as I was saying, if I was saying anything, but now we have these things called subdivisions, right? Where we have this it's really strange. It's like they're where a developer comes along, and actually where my son lives in Plano, which is just, I hope I'm not offending anyone from Plano, but it's just the whole thing is a subdivision, man. There's not like every I don't know, just track homes forever, right? But everything was built with a consumer in mind. And therefore, it was built, all the houses were built for that consumer and to look like houses and to look like town squares and to look like a city. But it has no sense of place, right? And so it seems to, it's like you're around it, and at least I can just feel the lack of meaning is just intense. It's built into the, right, to the it's profane, it's profanity, right? So I guess where that leaves me is well, one is just aware of that and making sense of that, right? And looking at it, trying to look at it straight in the, just straight in the face. But also start to wonder, where is place now? If it's not, if place, the body of place, is no longer in literal places, where is place now, if it could be somewhere else? Much love, everybody.